The first thing that struck Jonathan was how the fog didn't clear after the sun rose. It was one of those mornings where the clouds felt closer than the sky, heavy and wet like a woolen blanket soaked through. From the platform at Enslow Station, visibility was no more than 20 feet in any direction. The wooden slats beneath his feet were slick with dew, the kind that seemed to creep into the cuffs of his pants and never evaporate. Behind him, the tiny ticket booth was shuttered, a dark square shape beneath the swollen gray overhang. Not a soul in sight, not even the sleepy attendant who usually opened up with a rattle of keys and a complaint about the weather. Jonathan stood with a leather satchel slung across his back, gloved hands clasped around the strap. The train was late. At least he thought it was. His wristwatch, an old mechanical thing his uncle had passed down, showed the minute hand crawling just past the half hour. He couldn't be sure if it was still wound correctly. The posted schedule had faded from rain and years, barely legible behind the yellowing plastic frame. He was alone. And not just alone in the way people are in early morning places, but truly alone. No birds, no insects, no distant rumble of town activity or the dull groan of traffic from the highway. Just fog, the platform, and the silent steel tracks disappearing into white on both ends. The sound of the train came before its light, an old rattling groan that seemed too deliberate to be mechanical. It rose not from the horizon but from the ground itself, a shuddering low tone that trembled the planks beneath Jonathan's boots. He peered down the track, eyes narrowed, as a dull glow began to swell in the distance. It wasn't headlight bright, like modern engines, but a muted lantern glow, flickering as if the source burned oil instead of electricity. And then it emerged, not suddenly, but gradually, as if being pushed from behind by something reluctant. The locomotive rolled forward with a rhythmic huff, its black iron body streaked with soot and rust, like a museum piece pressed into reluctant duty. It didn't whistle. It didn't screech. It merely arrived, easing into view like a waking thought, its many windows dark or fogged from within. Jonathan took a half step back as the engine drifted to a halt in front of him. The passenger car doors were shut tight. No conductor leaned out. No lights switched on. But as he stared, the door across from him unlatched with a soft mechanical click and slid open with a dry hiss, revealing a dark, velvet-lined interior and rows of empty seats. There was no one else on the platform. No announcement. No sense of motion or urgency. Just silence. He looked down both ends of the platform once more. No sign of anyone, not even footprints in the dew. Slowly, he stepped forward, one foot on the stair, then another, his gloved hand gripping the iron rail. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of lavender and something older, polished wood, perhaps, or paper dried and sealed in leather bindings. The seats were wide and plush, the carpeting a faded burgundy whose pattern had long since blurred from decades of footsteps. He moved down the aisle, his boots making no sound on the thick carpet, and chose a seat beside the window, though the view was nothing but thick gray. The door shut behind him with a soft thud. No conductor, no voice, just the slow, inevitable lurch of motion as the train began to move, slipping away from the platform like a ghost disappearing into cloud. Jonathan didn't know where this train was going. He hadn't bought a ticket, but something in the air, perhaps the strange absence of sound or the way the train seemed older than travel itself, told him that this journey wasn't bound for any station on the map. As the fog pressed tighter against the windows and the engine hummed with a rhythmic heartbeat, Jonathan leaned back in his seat, eyes wide open, alert in a way he hadn't been in years. He felt like a man who had stepped across a boundary that no longer existed, a boundary that had never been drawn on any map, never been acknowledged by timetables or ticket booths. He had boarded a train, but not a train meant for him. And now, the only way forward was through. The train moved soundlessly through the fog. Outside the window, there was no landscape, only the same thick, motionless gray pressing against the glass, refusing to part. Occasionally, Jonathan thought he saw a vague shape beyond it, something tall or wide or leaning unnaturally close to the track. But whenever he focused, the shape would vanish into haze, like breath on a mirror fading before it could form. He pressed his gloved finger lightly to the glass. It was warm, not hot, not cold, just the precise temperature of skin. There was no vibration, no clatter of rails, no hum of electricity in the walls, just movement, slow and steady, forward and endless. He turned from the window and looked down the aisle. From where he sat, he could see the entire length of the car. 10 rows, 5 on each side. Each pair of seats was identical, carved wooden armrests, plush red cushions, and high velvet backs that loomed slightly inward, like the seats themselves were listening. But none were occupied, or rather, they hadn't been. As Jonathan leaned forward, frowning, he realized something had changed. There were coats draped now across a few seats, a folded newspaper on a cushion halfway down the row, a glint of something metal resting on an empty armrest, perhaps a pocket watch or a cufflink, or the edge of a pair of thin-rimmed spectacles, objects that hadn't been there when he entered. He stood slowly. The weight of his satchel shifted slightly, brushing against the seat. He stepped into the aisle, boots pressing soundlessly into the thick carpet. No creak of the frame, no moan of movement. But the further he walked, the more presence he felt, an undeniable suggestion of eyes watching from behind invisible lids. When he reached the 4th row, he stopped. Someone had placed a leather glove on the seat. Just one. It was pale brown and perfectly clean, as though recently removed. The fingers were curled slightly inward, as if still remembering the shape of the hand. Jonathan turned, scanning the car again. There was still no one visible, but the seats were no longer empty. He couldn't see the passengers, but he could sense them. There was a pressure in the air, a weight like being in a room filled with people who had forgotten how to breathe. He heard the soft rustle of fabric behind him, the creak of old leather, the sound of something light. Paper, perhaps, being turned, slow and deliberate. "Hello," he said softly. The car didn't answer. The train continued to slide through the fog, never slowing, never turning, its direction as indiscernible as its origin. Jonathan slowly backed away from the glove and returned to his seat. As he lowered himself, the cushion gave way beneath him, slightly too much, as if the seat was deeper now than it had been before. He placed his satchel beside him and glanced once more at the windows. The fog pressed against them like it was trying to get in. From the corner of his eye, movement. A head? No, just the trick of perspective. His reflection in the glass shifted, revealing another shape beside it. Faint, pale, and still. He turned. Nothing. He blinked. The seat across from him was now occupied by a coat. A charcoal-colored woolen thing with silver buttons and an old-style collar, folded neatly. On top of it, a hat, round-brimmed, wide, like something from another century. He reached out, but didn't touch it. The air smelled different now. Not the lavender and wood aroma from before, but something older, coal smoke, perhaps, or candle wax melted too long. The train moved. The world remained fog. Jonathan leaned back again, trying to quiet the pounding in his ears. The only sound was that of the train itself, soft, rhythmic, like an enormous clock just beneath the floor. The seats no longer felt empty. The corridor ahead seemed longer now, more dimly lit, as if the car had grown in size while his back was turned. Somewhere, further down, a whisper. Not words, just breath. A collective inhale. He stared forward, frozen. The seat beside him was no longer empty. He did not turn to look. He didn't move for a long time. His eyes remained fixed on the back of the seat in front of him, but his peripheral vision tingled with the certainty of presence. The weight of it. The thing beside him didn't shift, didn't breathe, didn't rustle clothes or tap fingers against the wooden armrest. But it was there. Not like a person. Not like a shadow. Like an echo, dense and unmoving. Jonathan tried to breathe quietly, but each inhale felt drawn out, too loud, invasive. His ribs ached with the pressure of restraint. He told himself that if he just waited long enough, it would leave. But nothing on this train seemed inclined to leave. Eventually, something did change. The lights. There were gas fixtures affixed above each window, mounted in tarnished brass sconces. They had been dim, warm, barely flickering like candlelight, but now they brightened, not by flame, but by presence, as if their fuel had been replaced with something unseen and limitless. One by one, the lights flared, not brighter in wattage, but in intensity, like waking eyes watching from walls. With each illumination, a fresh wave of details came into focus. The walls were carved, so subtly, so finely, that he hadn't noticed before. Tiny figures, overlapping like ants in a hill, all facing the same direction. Eyes elongated, arms outstretched. Some bore cloaks or robes. Some appeared faceless. The closer he looked, the more disturbing it became. Not just the volume of them, but the variation. No figure was quite the same, each carving a different position of pain or longing or silent, dreadful prayer. Jonathan stood slowly, the weight on the cushion beside him barely compressing. He didn't look down. He stepped into the aisle with forced calm, avoiding the temptation to glance at the seats as he passed. The train continued its forward, endless motion. Halfway down the car, he heard a click. Not mechanical, not human, just a sound, a signal that something had turned, like a key in a very old door. And then the lights began to extinguish. Not all at once, but one by one, in the exact reverse order of their awakening. Each going out with a brief flutter, a blink of resistance, and then stillness. From the back of the car toward the front, each darkness moved closer, folding space in on itself. Jonathan pressed his hand against the next door, a narrow panel at the far end of the car with a frosted glass window. Through it, he saw only more fog, but the knob turned easily under his grip, and the door opened with a reluctant wheeze. The next carriage was entirely different. Smaller, quieter, older if that was possible. Here, the walls were not velvet, but worn mahogany. The scent of damp stone clung to the air, like a crypt recently opened. Instead of rows of passenger seats, this car had compartments, small wooden chambers with sliding doors, some cracked slightly open, others shut tightly with heavy brass handles. And within those cracks, the suggestion of something waiting. The first compartment he passed had a door open just enough to let out a sliver of sound. A scraping, like nails along paper. It was rhythmic, careful, a practiced gesture. Jonathan didn't stop. The next had its window darkened from within by a curtain, but he could feel warmth radiating from it. The heat was unnatural, focused and pulsing, as if something inside the compartment was alive in a way no body should be. It reminded him of standing too close to a furnace whose door had been left slightly ajar. He passed a third, its door fully open. Inside sat a child's toy rocking horse. Alone. No dust. No wear. As if someone had placed it there minutes ago. The horse rocked, slowly, without aid. He didn't pause. At the very end of the corridor stood a final compartment. Its door closed, but unlike the others, sealed with a single cord of black twine knotted through a rusted iron loop. A symbol had been drawn on the wood in what looked like ash or soot. A circle, split in 3 equal parts, with each segment curling inward like a sleeping ear. Jonathan reached out to touch it, and stopped. The door was breathing. Not visibly, not theatrically, but subtly. The wood bowed and relaxed, in time with something internal, like lungs. And within something exhaled. Not air, not sound, but presence. The lights above dimmed again. The air drew inward. And behind him, in the corridor he'd passed, he heard the soft, unmistakable sound of a compartment door sliding open. Then another. And another. Jonathan didn't turn around. The sound of the doors opening came slowly, one after the other, like a hand brushing fingers down the length of piano keys, but soft, cautious, barely touching. First, the compartment with the rocking horse. Click. A door opening wider. Then, the warm compartment pulsing heat. Click. A sliding hush. Then the others. Those he hadn't dared look into. One by one, the hush of old wood on brass. Not rushed. Not aggressive. Just methodical. The corridor behind him filled with pressure, Not footsteps, not breathing, but attention. The same way a dark forest might notice you the moment you stepped between the trees. There was no movement, yet the air stirred. Jonathan felt the fine hairs along his neck lift with a shudder that didn't belong to the temperature. The floor beneath his boots remained perfectly still. The train didn't lurch, didn't creak, but the space between each heartbeat thickened like syrup. He stepped forward toward the breathing door. The iron loop trembled gently in its socket, not from his touch, but as if the knot remembered being unbound once before. The symbol drawn in soot was warm now. He could feel it just inches from his chest, radiating in slow pulses like the dull throb of something trying not to wake. Behind him, whispering began. Not loud, not words, a tickling at the edges of his hearing. Tiny syllables spoken by mouths too small to shape sound properly. A language that was less voice than intention, trickling through the walls like gas escaping from underground. The whispering didn't come from the passengers. Those were still absent, or invisible. These sounds came from the compartments. Each crack in the wood leaked whispers now, like fog curling under a closed door. Jonathan felt them brushing his legs, his arms, teasing the spaces between his fingers. One reached his ear and stayed there, not speaking, not moving, just resting against the canal, as if waiting to be invited inside. He turned sharply and looked down the corridor. The doors to every single compartment were now open. Not wide, just a few inches. But they were all listening. The darkness inside each one bloomed gently, stretching toward him, the way moss might reach for light after years without sun. Jonathan backed against the final door. It no longer breathed. It was holding its breath now, waiting. He thought to run. He considered briefly charging back through the corridor, slamming the doors, retracing his steps, throwing himself at the window, leaping into the fog, whatever that meant. If fog could be leapt into, if it wasn't just another skin to peel back. But the idea of leaving his back exposed to the open compartments felt worse than death. It felt like invitation. Then something moved, not beside him, not ahead, but within one of the compartments. Not a form, not a shadow, but a shift in temperature and space. A rearrangement of stillness. He felt it like a drop of cold oil in warm water, dense, wrong, unmistakable. Then another. Something stepped forward from a compartment 3 doors down. He heard it, not boots, not feet, but skin against the wooden floor. Bare, slow, like someone crawling upright for the first time in years. The whispering paused for that moment. Even the darkness seemed to suck inward in a tight breath. Jonathan turned back to the sealed door. His hands, moving with their own urgency, tugged at the black twine knot. It was stiff, impossibly tight, but as his fingers worked the cord, he realized it wasn't made of ordinary thread. It felt rough, papery, almost brittle, like braided bark soaked in salt and then set to dry. The knot resisted for a heartbeat longer. Then, snap. The twine split, unraveling into curled fragments that scattered like burnt leaves. The door creaked open on its own, releasing a sudden gust of cold air, cold not in temperature, but in absence. A void opened before him. The compartment was unlit, save for the very faintest glimmer at its far wall, a bluish silver glow, like moonlight through ice. Jonathan stepped inside. Behind him, the compartment doors creaked again. Not open, closed. Every one of them. All at once. The whispering stopped, and the train continued through the fog. He was alone again, but something waited in this new room. He sat down, not because he meant to, not because he wanted to, but because the seat seemed to insist. It had the shape of something once called a chair, but lacked any frame. It was as if the walls themselves had folded inward, curling like petals to cradle him. He did not resist. Before him, a pane of glass, small, square, flawless. The fog outside was thinner here, not clear, but allowing shapes beyond to assert themselves more confidently. Silhouettes of trees, of fences, of distant figures standing on nothing, unmoving, lining either side of the invisible track like mourners at a funeral whose procession never ends. And then, in the reflection of the window, Jonathan saw the other passenger. Not beside him. Not across. Behind. Jonathan didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The reflection in the window held his gaze with the force of gravity. Whatever stood behind him was not merely occupying the space. It was the space. A shape pulled from the grain of the wood, from the breath between seconds, from the soaked layers of the fog that clung to the train's sides. It wasn't a person, but it wore the suggestion of one. In the reflection, it appeared as a figure draped in thin, black cloth, not flowing, not loose, tight, like shrouds soaked and shrunk over bone. Its limbs were slightly too long. One shoulder dipped lower than the other, giving it a tilted, almost curious posture. Its head leaned forward, not quite inquisitive, not quite menacing, but close, as if listening. Jonathan could see no face, no mouth, no eyes, only a dark hollow where a face might have been sculpted and then forgotten. It didn't move. It didn't sway with the train's rhythm. It didn't flicker like the gaslight reflections. It simply remained. He wanted to breathe, but even that seemed like it might trigger a reaction. In the glass, the fog thickened again, but the figure stayed visible, a perfect silhouette etched into the light. Not a shadow, not an illusion. It didn't blink, didn't twitch. It existed with the heavy permanence of old statues, the kind you find in ruined churches, grown over by moss, forgotten but never quite lifeless. He counted. 3 seconds. 4. 5. Stillness. And then, it moved. Only slightly. Its head tilted to the opposite side. So slowly the motion might have gone unnoticed had Jonathan not been watching with unbroken focus. A shift of weight. A subtle lean forward. Closer. Jonathan stood. The movement behind him mirrored him, perfectly. It rose as he rose. But its posture was wrong, as though it didn't understand how humans balanced. It copied his motion like someone recalling how to walk after years of floating. He turned. The compartment behind him was empty. Nothing stood there. Only wood and velvet. Cold walls. Closed door. But the feeling didn't fade. He looked back to the window. The figure was still there. Now, it stood at his side in the reflection, one arm reaching out, bent at the elbow in that unnatural angle again, its hand poised just above his shoulder. Not touching, hovering, waiting. Jonathan stepped away from the window, and the lights above flickered, not the soft, fire-like flutter from before, but a seizing of light, stuttering as if caught in a strobe, freezing frames of the room around him in jagged moments. Each blink of darkness, he expected it to be closer. Each flare of light, he braced for its touch. But it didn't move. And that was worse. The door behind him creaked, just slightly ajar from where he had entered. The thing in the reflection turned its head again. No face, just motion, like an invitation. A silent request. Jonathan backed toward the door, forcing himself not to run, not to scream, not to stumble. If he broke the rhythm now, he knew it would respond. He knew it would close the distance between them, no matter what reality governed its movement. He reached the threshold. The train lurched for the first time, just slightly, just enough for him to brace against the doorframe. And in that moment, the lights above went out. Not one by one, not flickering, just gone. Black. Immediate. He could hear something inside the compartment now. Not words. Not whispers, but a pulse, a rhythm, wet slow, like the beat of something far beneath the floorboards. Something ancient, something coiled and resting in the dark of the train's belly. He stepped out into the corridor. The lights here were still dim, still awake, still watching. All the compartment doors were closed again. Not a sound from inside. No whispers, just silence. The door to the breathing compartment, now sealed again with fresh black twine, clicked softly shut behind him. The iron loop spun once. The knot retied itself in a single, fluid movement that made no sound at all. Jonathan stared at it, heart pounding. There were no markings on the wood now, no symbol, just a door. Innocent, dead. He continued down the corridor, back toward the velvet-carpeted car. The weight of the encounter clung to his skin like frost. As he passed the first compartment, the one with the rocking horse, he heard it begin to rock again. No wind, no motion, just movement. A back and forth rhythm, as though something invisible were sitting in it now, slowly pushing with ghostly legs. He did not look. The next compartment, the warm one, breathed heat again. But now, beneath the warmth, there was a faint hum. A sound too low to hear with ears, but strong enough to vibrate behind his teeth. And from the one with the paper scratching sound, silence. Just a single slip of parchment sliding itself through the crack under the door. It brushed against his foot. He bent to pick it up. The paper was damp and yellowed. On it, scratched in something dark, not quite ink, were 5 words, cramped and small. "You are not alone here." The parchment felt heavier than it should. Jonathan held it in one hand while the other gripped the brass handrail at the end of the corridor. His knuckles were white, but not from fear. Not anymore. Fear had given way to something quieter, something deeper. Resignation. He didn't want to open the door leading to the next train car. But standing still felt worse. The note's message had lodged itself in his chest, each word expanding like roots into his ribs. "You are not alone here." He pressed a palm against the frosted glass of the exit door. It was colder than the air around it, much colder. On the other side, a narrow vestibule. Another threshold. He pushed through. The sound changed instantly. Gone were the hush and the moans of wood and whispering velvet. Out here, in the tunnel between cars, the air howled through invisible cracks. Iron and rust sang in low tones. The floor vibrated beneath his boots, not wildly, but deeply, like the hum of something living underneath iron plates. It was darker here. Only a small light bulb hung from a wire above him, swaying slightly with the motion of the train. The bulb was caked with grime. Filmy yellow light painted long shadows across the coupling mechanism below. The tunnel smelled different too, like old coal and mold, mixed with something more subtle, animal. Not decay exactly, but fur. Breath. Wetness. The kind of smell that lived in dens. He moved forward slowly, boots grinding against metal, his back hunched to avoid the narrow ceiling. At the halfway point, something flickered in the corner of his vision. He snapped his head to the left, peering down through the tiny, diamond mesh grates on either side of the tunnel. Beneath the train, nothing but fog, swirling, endless. But it moved like water now, thicker, slower. Not drifting, but pouring, as if the train floated on some subterranean current. Then he heard the sound again. Tapping. From somewhere above. Not metal on metal. Not fingernails. Something softer. Pad. 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 Like bare feet on the roof of the car. Not running. Not frantic. Measured. It moved in pace with him. Jonathan froze. The tapping stopped too. He looked up. The ceiling panels here weren't solid. Small vents were built into the aluminum frame. Circular slats, spaced just enough to allow sound, maybe even air, to pass through. As he stared, one of the slats darkened. A shadow moved across the vent. Slow, deliberate. No footsteps this time, just motion. Then a sound like breath. Close. Just above the vent. Not exhaled, inhaled, as if something was smelling him. Jonathan kept moving. He didn't look back. Not once. He reached the far door, jammed the latch downward, and shoved it open with more force than he intended. The next train car was different. This was no passenger corridor. This was storage. Crates and trunks lined both walls, stacked from floor to ceiling. Some tied with rope, some nailed shut, others wrapped in thick canvas stained black with time and water. The room was tight, barely any space to move between the stacks. The air was dustier here, warmer too, as if breath had been trapped here for years, building into a musk. And the silence, it was not empty. It was the silence of expectation. Jonathan stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The tapping above resumed. Only now it was heavier, closer. Something was following him along the roof. He stood still, listening, but the sounds vanished again. Not gone. just relocated. It was moving ahead now, traveling over the storage car, moving faster than before, as though it knew where he was going. He pressed on. Each crate he passed whispered questions he couldn't hear. The faint creak of boards shifting, rope tightening, canvas brushing against itself like dry scales. Some trunks looked old enough to have traveled with the first trains ever made. Others were clearly newer, but marked with symbols he couldn't recognize. Circles, spirals, ink burned into the wood. Then came the first broken one. Halfway down the car, a trunk had burst open. Not violently, not like something had exploded from within. It had peeled. The canvas had split down the center like a mouth, its edges curled outward. The contents inside had been removed, or had removed themselves. All that remained was a thick trail of something dark and sticky across the floor, winding toward the far end of the car. Jonathan didn't follow the trail. He didn't want to know what could peel a trunk open that way. But he could hear breathing again, this time below. He crouched. The space between the crates was narrow, but the floorboards had gaps, wider ones here. He lowered his head and looked between the planks. Beneath the storage car, in a shallow crawl space between train and track, something moved. Not crawling, not slithering, just watching. Two eyes. Yellow, set far apart, blinking slowly. The eyes didn't retreat when Jonathan met their gaze. They didn't widen or squint. They just remained, soaking in the shape of him through the floorboards. Jonathan rose quickly. Ahead, the car stretched into deeper shadows. At the very end, the next vestibule waited. Another junction, another set of doors. He passed more trunks. One hissed. Another moaned. One near the door trembled faintly, as if something inside was shifting to get more comfortable. Jonathan didn't pause. He opened the far door, stepped out into the next vestibule, and slammed it behind him. But the air out here was wrong, too. Colder, wetter, and there were fingerprints on the glass already. Inside, smudged, pressed outward, from a hand that hadn't belonged to him. He turned. The fog beyond this junction was thicker again. Shapes moved in it now. Not figures, not people, but things. Low, wide, crawling, like parts of the train had spilled into the world and were now hunting themselves. Above, the roof creaked again, this time not with feet, but with weight. He gripped the handle of the next door, but didn't open it. There was a stillness beyond it that defied the motion of the train, like the space inside had detached from time entirely. Jonathan's fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the deep knowledge that something awaited him in the next car that would recognize him before he could recognize it. He opened the door. The hinges didn't creak. They sighed. And beyond them, silence. No footsteps. No wind. No humming steel. Only breathless calm. He stepped in. At first, the darkness was complete. He couldn't tell whether the lights were off or simply swallowed. But then they bloomed, not lit, exactly, but awakened. Dim globes embedded in the ceiling flared like old memories, faint and flickering. The color of their glow wasn't yellow or white. It was the color of deep water. Blue-green, uncertain. The kind of light that illuminates only what it wants to. He blinked hard, letting his eyes adjust. This car was long. Much longer than it should have been. It couldn't have fit between the others. Not physically. And it was filled with beds. Not seats. Not trunks. Not compartments. Rows and rows of beds. Not like hospital cots or sleeper bunks. These were heavy things, frames of wrought iron and carved wood, each draped in thick sheets, some canopied, others bare. Some had pillows that bore the shape of heads long gone. Others had indentations in the sheets like someone had just left or was about to return. The air smelled of dried flowers and dust. Jonathan stepped forward. The floorboards didn't creak, but they shifted. Gently, like the boards themselves were breathing, inhale, exhale, beneath his feet. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. He passed the first bed. The pillow was yellowed. The blanket turned down, folded with care. There was a smell lavender and mothballs. At the foot of the bed, a small suitcase. Open. Empty, not dusty. Jonathan glanced at the next bed. Someone was in it.
He stopped.
The figure was motionless, covers drawn just below the chin. Pale hands rested over the blanket.
Thin. Old.
But no decay, just stillness. Eyes closed. The chest did not rise or fall. Dead? He leaned closer. The face was smooth, porcelain pale, features nearly perfect in symmetry. Almost too perfect, as if it had been shaped, sculpted. Then the lips moved. A single word, not spoken, just shaped in silence. Stay. Jonathan stepped back. The figure did not move again. He turned and continued, passing more beds. Some were empty. Some were occupied, each with a sleeper. Some young, some impossibly old. One was not human at all. It had too many joints in the fingers and no mouth. But it slept. They all did. But the worst were the beds that looked sat in. Not slept in. Not empty. Just recently used. Indentations. Heat still rising. Sheet pulled back just enough to suggest someone had left only moments before. And always, beside those beds on the floor, wet footprints.
Bare.
Child-sized. Jonathan walked faster. Somewhere in the middle of the car, the rows of beds narrowed. The ceiling dipped. The floorboards moaned beneath the weight of silence. He turned a corner. Wait, a corner? This car wasn't linear anymore. It had curved, subtly, into a long, meandering corridor of sleep. And now, the beds were less ordinary. Some were suspended from the ceiling, cradled in ropes and chains, swaying faintly as if rocked by invisible hands. Others were embedded into the walls, alcoves of shadow where pale eyes gleamed in the dark, never blinking, never closing. One had no occupant at all, but the sheets crawled slowly, like breath had been left behind and couldn't find its way out. Then he heard it. A song. No, not a song, a lullaby.
Faint.
Wordless. Hummed in a voice that didn't belong in the throat of anything alive.
High. Thin.
Like wind through broken glass. He froze. The voice came from ahead. It grew louder with each step, though it never changed in pitch or tone. The hallway narrowed again, and at its end, a single, massive bed. It towered toward the ceiling, its posts carved from something that looked like bone, but not human. Its sheets were black silk, wet with condensation. The pillows were sewn from leather, glistening like it had been oiled. Atop the bed was a shape, bigger than a man, too big, lying on its side, facing away. The lullaby came from it, or from under it. Jonathan didn't move closer. Not this time. Instead, he turned to the nearest bed and sat. The sheets sighed beneath him. He stared across the car at the sleepers, at the breathing silence that filled every inch of space. And then he heard the tapping again. Not above this time.
Below.
Below his bed. From within the frame, a voice whispered from the mattress. Not loud, not threatening, just curious. Do you dream of it yet? He did not sleep. Jonathan sat on the edge of the bed long after the whisper had ceased, listening to the silence reassemble itself in fragments. The tapping beneath him had stopped. The lullaby had faded. But the presence, whatever that unseen force was that threaded the seams of this train, remained thick in the air, woven into each breath like ash. He stood. The wet footprints still glistened faintly in the blue-green glow of the overhead orbs. They led toward a corner of the car that curved away from his line of sight, another impossible bend in a space that should not have had any. He followed them. He didn't want to, but his feet moved as though they knew something he didn't, as though they belonged to someone else now. The prince turned, paused near an alcove bed, and then curved again. The pattern reminded him of a child skipping, perhaps dragging a toy, or dancing in a game known only to them. The alcove they ended at was smaller than the others, swallowed in velvet drapery and shadow. The bed within it was sunken and curled inward, more like a nest than a cot. Jonathan reached forward to draw the curtain, and the moment his fingers brushed the fabric, the entire bed collapsed inward, as if swallowed from below. A burst of dust, feathers, and fog spat outward and scattered into the aisle. There was nothing left in the space, just a hole where the bedding had been.
Not deep.
But deep enough. He didn't look inside. He turned, and that's when he saw the man in the mirror coat. At first, it looked like a hanging garment on the far wall, something draped on a coat rack or left behind on a hook. But then it moved,
Slowly.
gracefully, like a dancer emerging from behind a curtain. It was a tall figure, wrapped from neck to ankles in a coat made entirely of mirrors. Hundreds of pieces, shattered and bent, patched together into a long garment that hissed softly with each shift of the arms. The mirrors did not reflect the light around them as they should have. They bent it, warped it, turned it inward, as if drinking it. Where the face should have been, there was none. Just another mirror, cracked down the middle. And in it, Jonathan saw his own reflection, but not as he was. His reflection was older, hollow-eyed, mouth sewn shut with black thread. Something flickered behind its shoulders in the mirrored world, a shadow of himself, almost skeletal, bound in spider silk and whispering into his ear. The man in the mirror coat raised one hand, and Jonathan's reflection raised both. Out of sync.
Wrong.
Jonathan stepped back. The figure followed, but not forward, around. It moved along the edge of the car without walking, gliding across the floor like its feet were greased rails themselves. Wherever it passed, the sleepers in the beds turned their heads slowly, one by one, as if sensing the presence. Not waking, just acknowledging. Some smiled faintly, some wept. The man's coat hissed louder with each step. The mirrors clicked together with soft chimes, almost musical, almost soothing. Then it stopped, and turned its head toward Jonathan. A voice, brittle as flint scraping glass, emerged not from the face, but from inside the mirrors. "Do you know what you are yet?" Jonathan opened his mouth, but the words failed. His throat felt packed with wool. He swallowed, tried again, but no sound emerged. The man didn't move. He waited, and in the silence that followed, the mirrors on his coat began to change. They stopped reflecting the car, stopped reflecting Jonathan. Instead, they showed something else entirely. A forest, ancient, rotting trees, a circle of stones with blackened runes, the base of a wooden cross buried in soil, its surface still wet with something dark. Then another image, a boy, himself no older than 8, standing at the edge of a field, watching something burn. A doll clenched in his hand, the smoke rising behind him shaped like a figure with no face. Jonathan took a step closer, and the mirrors flared white for a moment. Now they showed a cabin, dark interior, a woman hunched beside a stove, stirring nothing in a pot, a door slightly ajar, behind which something breathed. Jonathan recoiled. The mirror coat clicked shut, wrapping tightly around the man like armor. "You are forgetting," said the voice. "It is beginning again." The figure turned and began to dissolve, not into air, not into dust, but into reflections. Pieces of the coat peeled away, floating upward like bubbles, catching flickers of memory inside them. One mirrored shard hovered beside Jonathan's cheek. In it, he saw a version of himself seated on the same train, alone in the sleeper car, eyes closed, but the reflection's chest didn't rise. Still, lifeless. Another shard floated past, a version of himself laughing, surrounded by people whose faces were blurred by smoke. And another, of him lying on a hospital bed, mouth open, staring at a ceiling light that spun slowly, too slowly. He reached out to touch one. His finger passed through, cold, empty,
Gone.
The final shard hovered before his eyes. In it, no image, just darkness, and something breathing from inside it. Then the shard vanished. The car was empty again. No sleeper stirred. No footsteps marked the aisle. And Jonathan was alone once more. But now, the mirrors lived in his mind, and he could feel them watching him. The next door was far away, too far. No matter how many steps Jonathan took, it didn't grow closer. The aisle between the beds stretched and bent, repeating itself like a corridor in a dream. The beds began to double back on each other, some stacked vertically now, others sinking into the floor like melting wax. He stopped walking and closed his eyes. The moment he did, the train jolted. Not a violent lurch, but a subtle change, like the whole machine had taken a breath inward. When he opened his eyes, the door was in front of him, as if it had crept up behind him while he wasn't looking and rearranged the space to trap him in another kind of forward. The handle was warm. The moment he touched it, he heard a distant chime, a delicate, brittle sound, like glass being tapped lightly by a fingernail. It echoed through the car he had left. The sleepers behind him didn't stir, but he thought, for just a second, that he heard one of them laugh softly, like a child remembering a secret joke. He stepped through the door, and into darkness. Not the absence of light. This was willful darkness. Heavy, pressing in on all sides. Not just the visual sort, but the kind that clung to the skin like oil and filled the lungs with damp wool. The air was thick with the scent of copper, mildew, and stale incense. He reached to feel for a wall. His hand met nothing. Not emptiness, just absence, as though the walls of the train had given up their shape. He turned. The door was gone. The sleeper car had vanished behind him, replaced with shadow that pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of something enormous and buried. Then footsteps. Slow, measured, coming from ahead. They echoed without source, each one followed by the faintest hiss, like someone dragging cloth behind them. Jonathan backed away, but the darkness gave no bearings, no frame of reference. He could have been spinning in circles and wouldn't have known. He stopped moving. So did the steps. He waited.
So did they.
Then a light appeared. No, several. Flickers, dim and colorless, bobbing slowly, like lanterns made from submerged skulls, lit from within by dying fireflies. They revealed the barest outlines of the car, a floor warped like bark, benches carved from a material that looked like bone but pulsed like flesh. No windows, only narrow slits near the ceiling, like the gills of a fish. The lights drifted closer. They weren't lanterns. They were eyes.
Pale.
Translucent, hanging in the air, unattached to any visible body. Jonathan backed away, but something soft brushed the back of his neck. He turned and met the face of a mirror child. It was him again, 8 years old. Only wrong. Its skin was translucent, stretched too thin. Its eyes were the same bobbing lights he'd seen moments before, and its mouth was missing. In its place was a swirling pit, as if someone had tried to erase it from reality and failed halfway through. The mirror child raised one hand and touched Jonathan's chest. He felt it immediately, a flutter beneath his ribs. Not fear, not pain, a presence, something living inside him that had not always been there. He gasped. The child pressed harder, and Jonathan collapsed to one knee. Inside his mind, something cracked. A memory opened. He was standing at the top of a staircase. A girl was laughing below. His sister?
No.
Not quite. Someone like a sister. She was laughing, spinning in a circle, holding a red ribbon. He called out to her. She didn't hear. He stepped down, and a shriek filled the air. Back in the car, Jonathan clutched his chest as the vision snapped away. The child was gone. The lights had scattered, drifting now across the space like fireflies that had lost their queen. And on the far side of the car, a shape emerged. Tall, looming, draped in veils made of old hair, knotted and stained. It wore robes that dragged across the floor, wet with something that stuck to the boards. Its arms were long and jointless, bending in a slow, impossible arc as it reached toward the ceiling. And, hanging from the fingers, bells. Dozens of tiny bells, each one different.
Glass. Iron. Shell. Bone. Teeth.
They made no sound, not until it looked at Jonathan. When its head turned, the bells screamed. Not ringing, screaming. High, shrill, layered with the voices of children and animals and wind shrieking through broken windows. Jonathan covered his ears. But the sound wasn't in the air. It was in his teeth, vibrating in his bones, flooding his blood. The figure took a step forward, dragging its veil. The floor split beneath it, not from weight, but from memory. The boards buckled and curled, revealing flashes beneath them. A classroom where everyone turned at once to look at him. A birthday cake no one touched. A hallway with peeling wallpaper and a door that thudded rhythmically even though it was locked. Jonathan screamed, or tried to. No sound came out. The figure reached toward him with one long, curling hand. It didn't touch him. It brushed past. And in that moment, every part of him that had ever been forgotten, every time someone had failed to remember his name, every photo he wasn't in, every memory someone else had lost of him, rushed back. A storm of absence.
He fell. Hard.
And the car caught him. The floor warped upward to cradle his back. A dozen ghostly hands reached up through the boards and pressed gently to his chest, stilling his breath, guiding his heartbeat. The bells stopped. The figure withdrew. Jonathan lay in silence. And above him, the gill-like slits in the ceiling opened. Just a crack, revealing the sky outside. It was not night.
It was not day.
It was a color he had no word for, and it was watching him. Jonathan opened his eyes again to stillness. He was lying on a smooth metal floor, cold enough that it stuck to the skin of his cheek. The train was still in motion, but everything had changed again. The car was narrow, far too narrow for a passenger car. It felt like a crawl space stretched horizontally into forever, with a ceiling just high enough to sit upright in, and a floor scattered with objects that clinked and whispered when touched. He sat up slowly. The air was frigid. Each breath scraped his throat, dry and sharp like breathing through linen soaked in bleach. The walls on either side of him were made of iron, pitted and old, coated with a white frost that never quite melted. Every sound in this carriage echoed, his breath, his movements, even the pounding of his heart. Above him, a string of lights ran the length of the ceiling, old bulbs caged in rusted wire. Most were broken. The few still functioning buzzed faintly with a pale yellow flicker, offering no warmth. The first thing he noticed was the smell. It was chemical, something like ammonia or freezer-burned meat thawed in sun. But underneath it, faint and growing, was a familiar scent.
Soil.
Wet earth, churned up by spades and boots. Jonathan began crawling forward, palms numb from the floor's bite. The objects scattered around him became clearer now, photos, scattered across the floor like spilled cards. Some were black and white, others faded color, all curled at the edges and cracked with age. He picked one up. It was of a man sitting on a bench in a park. His face had been scratched out, not violently but carefully, deliberately. A precise spiral carved over where the head had been. Another photo, a woman holding a baby. Both of their faces smudged with a gray film that didn't come off. A third, a classroom. 20 desks, 19 students, one empty chair. Jonathan looked closer and saw a faint shadow where the missing child should have been. He kept crawling. The photos increased in number. Soon the floor was completely covered. Then the walls. Then the ceiling. And every face in every image was marred, removed, replaced. The photos clung to the surfaces with no glue, as though magnetized by some unseen current. The lights above buzzed louder. Ahead, a shape emerged from the haze. Not a person, a structure, a coffin, suspended upright in the center of the car. Not wooden, but glass, frosted over from within. It was narrow, shaped more like a capsule, with iron clamps bolted into the floor to keep it from moving. Frost bloomed across its surface in branching, flower-like spirals. Inside, barely visible through the icy condensation, was a figure. Jonathan crawled closer. A pale hand rested against the interior of the glass, fingers splayed. Female, delicate, skin tinged blue at the edges. Her face was pressed against the surface, but distorted by frost. Eyes open, mouth slightly parted. He felt he had seen her before. Not recently. A long time ago. Something in his stomach turned. A memory surfaced like a fish from deep water, slick, unexpected, dying for air. A voice. Not hers. His mother's. When you were 3, you said her name in your sleep every night for a month. I thought you had an imaginary friend." He hadn't remembered that until now. He leaned closer. Something moved in the frost. Not the woman, the frost itself. It contracted, pulling away from the glass in tiny veins. Then it formed letters.
Words.
"I never left." Jonathan stumbled back. The train groaned. The coffin shuddered slightly, just enough that the clamps creaked. And behind him, another sound arose.
Clocks. Dozens of them. He turned.
On every surface now, ticking, talking, spinning, hundreds of mismatched clocks had appeared. Grandfather clocks, wristwatches, kitchen timers, all out of sync, all running backward, their hands jerking like insects caught in web. Each clock was counting something down. Some moved quickly, some didn't move at all. But the closer he looked, the more he saw one thing they all shared, a name. His name, etched on the face of each clock. Jonathan Ingram.
Scrawled by hand.
Stamped in rust, carved with fingernails, burned with fire. And then a chime. One clock hit 0, and from the glass coffin came a single knock. Then another. Then silence. Jonathan backed away. The light dimmed. And for a moment, just a moment, every single clock stopped. The silence that followed was impossible. So deep it erased every sound in the world. No engine, no train, no breath. And then,
Crash.
the glass shattered from within. He shielded his face, but no shard struck him. The coffin was empty. Where the woman had been, there was only ash. Ash and a red ribbon coiled like a sleeping snake. He didn't remember picking it up, but it was in his hand now, cold as ice. Jonathan held the ribbon tightly, its texture rough and brittle against his skin despite its delicate appearance. It pulsed faintly in his hand, like the slow beat of a distant heart or a secret whispered across time. The color was faded, once bright red, now muted like dried blood, yet the hue seemed to absorb the faint blue-green light above, darkening with every second. He looked around the car, the cold carriage, now devoid of clocks. The shattered coffin lay in silent ruin, shards glittering like fallen stars across the frosted floor. The air trembled slightly, as if the train itself had drawn breath after a long, painful exhale. Jonathan's fingers tightened on the ribbon, and the faint pulse accelerated, syncing with the rapid thump of his own heartbeat. An urgent rhythm began to echo inside his mind, a thread unraveling, dragging him backward into memories he hadn't dared touch. The ribbon tugged. A doorway appeared at the far end of the carriage, not a physical door. A curtain of mist, shimmering with faintly glowing threads, swayed gently in the unnatural breeze of the carriage's chill. The edges of the mist shimmered like broken glass, fragments of light suspended midair. Compelled beyond reason, Jonathan stepped forward. The ribbon seemed to guide him, twisting and curling in the air, a serpent weaving a path through fog. He passed through the veil of mist. The world shifted. The cold carriage dissolved into darkness. Jonathan found himself standing in a vast, empty field under a sky that shimmered with countless stars, too many to count, each one flickering with an unnatural light, cold and distant. The ground beneath him was soft, like moss soaked with rain, and every step sank slightly into the earth. Ahead, a small figure waited, a child. The same child he had seen before, the translucent mirror child, eyes like glowing orbs, mouth absent. The child beckoned silently, extending a hand. Jonathan reached out. The moment their fingers brushed, the world shuddered. The stars pulsed and stretched, blurring into streaks of light. The field rippled beneath his feet. Images flooded his mind, fragmented scenes from a life half remembered and half forgotten. A cabin in a dense forest, smoke curling from its chimney. A broken swing hanging from a tree, swaying without wind. A woman humming softly by a stove, stirring a pot filled with shadows. A boy standing at the edge of a burning field, clutching a doll singed at the edges. Whispers echoing in the walls of a train, laughter without joy. The child's voice, though silent, resonated inside him, an unspoken song of longing, loss, and the threads that bind. Jonathan understood. He had been following the ribbon not just through the train, but through the woven layers of his own past, his own forgotten truths. The child smiled, an expression without lips. Then the stars above began to pulse faster, turning the sky into a spinning vortex. The field stretched and twisted, pulling Jonathan deeper. The ribbon tightened in his grasp, guiding him into the heart of the vortex. The vortex swallowed Jonathan whole. Light bent and fractured around him, folding space into a spiraling tunnel of shifting colors and shifting shapes. His body felt weightless, yet every fiber of his being screamed as if stretched across an impossible distance. The ribbon in his hand pulsed rhythmically, tightening, guiding him deeper into the spiral. Around him, scenes from the train, his memories, and things that defied explanation swirled together in a dizzying kaleidoscope. Faces flashed, some his own at various ages, others faceless or obscured by shadow. A chorus of whispers echoed around him, overlapping and distorting, repeating fragments of phrases he couldn't quite catch. Remember, remember, remember. The voice was both inside and outside him, a breath against his skin, and a scream within his mind. He tried to hold onto the ribbon, to the thread of reality, but the spiral seemed to twist tighter with every rotation. He felt his feet touch ground again, but it wasn't solid. It was a surface that rippled like water beneath his weight. The vortex slowed. Jonathan found himself standing at the bottom of a narrow stone stairway carved into an ancient tree trunk. The wood was blackened, wet, and alive with crawling moss and tiny glowing fungi. The air smelled of earth and decay. He looked up and saw the mouth of the tree, the opening to the surface world, framed by twisting roots that coiled like serpents. The stars were just visible through the canopy above, cold and distant. But below, the stairs descended into darkness. The ribbon tugged again. Jonathan stepped down. Each step echoed softly, a hollow sound that seemed to come from somewhere far beneath him. The air grew colder, damper, filled with the scent of old stone and forgotten things. The walls of the stairwell were etched with strange symbols, spirals and lines that seemed to writhe as he passed. His fingers brushed them, and a faint electric current prickled through his skin. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. Return, return, return. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy wooden door stood ajar. Beyond it was a cavernous chamber lit by phosphorescent crystals embedded in the walls. The air thrummed with an energy both terrifying and familiar. In the center of the chamber was a shallow pool of black water, still and mirror-like. Jonathan approached. He gazed into the water and saw not his reflection, but a swirling mass of shadows and faces, some distorted, some serene, some twisted in agony. The ribbon slipped from his fingers and floated above the pool, coiling around an unseen force beneath the surface. A voice rose from the depths, a low, guttural chant in a language older than words. Jonathan felt himself drawn closer, the pool pulling him in like a siren's call. He reached out. The water was ice cold. His hand broke the surface, and the ripple expanded outward, distorting the faces within. Suddenly, the pool convulsed. The water boiled. Shadows leapt from the surface and formed into a figure, tall, faceless, draped in shifting darkness. It extended a hand toward Jonathan, and in that moment he understood. The train, the sleepers, the ribbon, the reflections, they were all threads in a tapestry of something ancient and vast. Something that had been waiting for him to come home. The dark figure stood silently before Jonathan, its form both immense and fluid, like smoke caught in a frozen moment. Where its face should have been, there was only an endless void that seemed to suck in light and hope alike. The pool's water rippled gently at its feet, a black mirror reflecting nothing and everything. Jonathan wanted to retreat, but his feet felt rooted to the stone floor, as if the earth itself had grasped him. The ribbon, now tangled around the figure's arm like a tether, pulsed with a slow, steady beat, heartbeat or signal. He couldn't tell. Then the figure moved, not toward him, but away, beckoning with a gloved hand fashioned from shadow. It stepped aside, revealing a narrow passage carved into the rock behind it, winding deeper into the earth. Jonathan hesitated. Something about this place felt like a crossroads, an intersection between memory and oblivion. Without conscious thought, he followed. The passage was tight and uneven. The air grew colder still, each breath a sharp stab in his lungs. The walls seemed to hum softly, resonating with a deep, distant vibration, like the heartbeat of the train itself, but fainter, more rhythmic. He came to a small chamber illuminated by candles whose flames flickered without wind. Against one wall hung a coat rack. On it a long, threadbare coat. The very same mirror coat. His heart pounded as he reached out to touch it. The moment his fingers brushed the cracked, mirrored surface, a surge of images flooded his mind. Faces long forgotten, places he had never seen but instinctively knew, voices whispering names, his name, and warnings tangled with promises. He staggered back, gasping for breath. The dark figure's voice echoed softly, not from its mouth, but inside his head. "You cannot run." Jonathan swallowed hard, voice barely a whisper. Who are you?" The figure's response was a breath on his skin, a chill curling down his spine. The keeper, the conductor, the thread between here and everywhere else. The place where memories are lost and found. Jonathan looked up to see the figure's hand extended toward him, a finger pointing to the passage behind. "The train moves on. You must choose, stay in the darkness, or step forward into the unknown." The words hung heavy. Jonathan's mind raced. He thought of the sleepers, the ribbon, the mirrors, the child, the voices. He realized that this journey was no longer about escape. It was about choice. Behind the figure, the passage stretched endlessly. But to his left, he glimpsed a faint glimmer of light, a doorway leading back, perhaps, to the cold carriage or the endless train. The figure's voice pressed again. "Time is unspooling. Your moment is here." Jonathan closed his eyes. The ribbon pulsed stronger in his hand. He took a breath and stepped forward. Jonathan emerged into a vast space unlike any station or platform he had ever seen. It stretched infinitely in every direction, a labyrinthine expanse of gleaming stone and shadow that seemed both ancient and impossibly new. The air was thick with the scent of cold rain and burnt leaves, and the faint hum of distant machinery thrummed beneath the floor. Around him, colossal pillars rose toward a ceiling lost in darkness, each etched with faded runes and swirling patterns that pulsed faintly with an otherworldly light. Suspended between the pillars were countless suspended lanterns, their flames flickering without wind, casting a pale glow that danced across the endless rows of rails that vanished into the mist. The rails were crowded with trains, not like the one he had boarded, but spectral and half-formed, their cars twisting and bending in ways that defied physics. Some were shrouded in thick fog, others burned softly with an eerie inner fire, and many carried faces pressed to the windows, faces like his own, faces twisted in silent screams, or lost in eternal slumber. Jonathan's footsteps echoed hollowly as he walked the platform. He felt the weight of countless eyes upon him, watching, waiting. The ribbon in his hand fluttered weakly, as though trying to escape. A voice called from the darkness, low and resonant. "Welcome, traveler." From between the pillars, a figure approached, a conductor clad in a long coat woven of shadows and starlight. His face was obscured beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but his eyes gleamed like twin moons in the gloom. "The train you rode was no ordinary passage," the conductor said, voice smooth and unyielding. "It carries those caught between moments, between memories, between realities. A liminal voyage for souls adrift." Jonathan clenched the ribbon. "Why me?" he asked. "Why this journey?" The conductor smiled, though the smile did not reach his eyes. "Because you carry the thread, the ribbon that binds the lost to the found. The train moves for those who remember and those who have forgotten. And now, it is time to choose your place." The platform shifted subtly, the rails bending to form two diverging paths, one glowing faintly with warm light, the other swallowed in shadow deeper than night. The conductor gestured. Step onto the path of light to reclaim what was lost, to awaken from the endless sleep. Or step into the shadow to embrace the silence and become part of the train's eternal journey. Jonathan's breath caught. The choice hung between the rails like a knife poised to cut fate itself. The ribbon pulsed for one last time, blazing a bright red before dimming to ash.
He took a step.
Jonathan's foot hovered above the glowing path, the warmth radiating through the soles of his shoes like a heartbeat awakening beneath frozen ground. The shadows of the other path seemed to stretch and recoil in silent protest, tendrils of darkness flickering at the edges, whispering secrets he could almost understand but dared not listen to. His mind was a whirlwind of fragmented memories. The train cars filled with sleepers, the mirror coat that reflected fractured truths, the coffin sealed in frost, and the ribbon that wound its way through time like a living thing. Each thread pulled at his soul, weaving together a tapestry both beautiful and terrible. A single breath, slow and steady. And then he stepped forward. The light embraced him like a tide, gentle and insistent. It poured into his lungs, filled the empty spaces where forgotten memories had taken root. Shapes that had blurred at the edges became vivid. Faces remembered and names recalled. He saw the girl from his childhood, spinning in the smoke-lit field, the ribbon once hers, now his to hold. He felt the warmth of a mother's voice humming by the stove, a lullaby woven from shadows and hope. The endless train was no longer a prison, but a vessel carrying him home. The conductor watched silently as Jonathan moved deeper into the light, the path unfurling beneath his feet like a river of stars. Behind him, the shadowed rails faded, dissolving into nothingness. The sleepers in the distant cars began to stir, eyes fluttering open, faces softening as if waking from a dream they'd long feared to end. Jonathan reached the end of the platform, where a door framed by ancient runes awaited. Beyond it lay the world he had lost, and now found again. He pushed the door open. A rush of wind, sharp and sweet, swept through him. The sky unfolded in a canvas of dawn colors, the first rays of sunlight warming his face. Birds sang somewhere beyond the horizon, and the scent of earth and rain filled the air. He stepped through. The train, the sleepers, the shadows, they all receded like a dream fading upon waking. Jonathan stood alone beneath the open sky, the ribbon tied firmly around his wrist, a thread connecting past, present, and future. He was free, but somewhere deep in the distance, faint and fading, he heard the softest echo of a lullaby, a reminder that some journeys never truly end.